never thought I'd hear from him again, I whispered to myself as I held the crisp envelope in my hands, the handwriting unmistakable, the familiar loops of my husband James' hand decades ago, though now faded and slightly shaky, staring back at me. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, casting light over the counters where I had just set out the coffee and my favorite blue china, a ritual I had maintained every morning for the past 10 years, a ritual that had become almost meditative in its solitude. My heart pounded, a strange mixture of disbelief and curiosity twisting inside me as I carefully turned the envelope over, examining the postmark and the return address, all confirming what my mind refused to fully accept. This letter had come from him. 10 years had passed since James died. 10 years since I had last heard his voice or felt the warmth of his hand in mine, and yet here it was, a tangible piece of him delivered through the mail, as if time had bent on itself to return a fragment of the past. I set the letter down on the oak kitchen table, the polished surface reflecting the morning light, and sat down heavily in my chair, feeling the weight of the years press down on my shoulders, the silence in the house around me suddenly deafening. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves in the yard, the soft sound grounding me while my thoughts raced. I reached for the letter again, my fingers trembling slightly, and felt the paper between my fingertips, the texture familiar, yet alien, as if holding it might bring James back or reveal the answers I had longed for over a decade. The scent of his cologne, a faint memory in the air, seemed to linger, teasing my senses and reminding me of the mornings we had shared coffee in this very kitchen, laughing softly, planning days that would never come again. I thought about my son Michael, now in his mid-40s, and how life had moved on for him, how he had grown into a man shaped by the absence of his father, and how Linda, my daughter-in-law, had always carried herself with a careful balance of politeness and subtle manipulation, her eyes occasionally betraying thoughts she never voiced, making me wary of every interaction, even in the most ordinary family moment. I slowly broke the seal on the envelope, careful not to tear the fragile paper, and unfolded the letter with deliberate movements, the neat lines of script immediately drawing me in, the words carrying a weight I hadn't anticipated, a mixture of familiarity, mystery, and a strange sense of urgency. Each sentence seemed carefully chosen, echoing his voice as it had been, both comforting and disconcerting, filling the kitchen with an atmosphere of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. I read and reread the opening lines, my eyes scanning over the words that spoke of regret, reflection, and things left unsaid, a catalogue of moments that had slipped through our lives, a gentle confession and a challenge wrapped in ink and paper, stirring feelings that had lain dormant, a blend of sorrow, warmth, and the haunting curiosity of what had been hidden. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow breath, feeling the morning calm around me, yet within, a storm of questions had begun to brew, questions about why now, why after so long, and what had driven him to send this message from beyond the years. And as the sunlight shifted across the kitchen, catching the edges of the letter, I realized that my day, my sense of ordinary routine, had been irrevocably altered by this single, fragile piece of correspondence that held more power than any conversation, any memory, any photograph ever could, and I knew that I would spend hours, perhaps days, unraveling the meaning, the implications, the secret life of the words he had left me, a journey into the past that would bring clarity, reckoning, and perhaps a measure of closure I had not dared hope for over the decade that had passed since James had gone. The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle ticking of the wall clock, a sound that seemed louder than usual in the stillness of the morning, and I poured myself another cup of coffee, the steam rising in thin curls, carrying with it a faint aroma of cinnamon from the small candle burning on the counter. I sat at the table, the letter lying unopened beside my cup, staring out the window at the garden where the hydrangeas had begun to bloom, their pale blues and soft pinks a reminder of seasons past, of life moving forward even when I had felt stagnant. The house felt unusually large, each creak of the floorboards echoing in the silence, reminding me of how long it had been since I had shared these spaces with James, since our conversations had filled the air with warmth and gentle laughter. I allowed my mind to drift back to the years immediately following his passing, the slow adjustments, the quiet dinners alone, the moments of grief that were so personal, so private, that even my son Michael could only observe from a distance, never fully bridging the gap that loss had created. The letter remained at my side and I could not resist the pull to reach for it again, to feel the weight of paper between my fingers, the familiar texture both comforting and unsettling, and I thought about the careful handwriting, how it carried the essence of James' personality, meticulous, attentive, deliberate. I reflected on the life we had built together, the house in the suburbs, the annual family holidays, the small traditions that had woven our family into a coherent tapestry of memories, and now a single piece of paper threatened to unravel questions I had long believed resolved. I recalled the afternoons spent tending the garden, his hand guiding mine as we planted tulip bulbs in the early spring, the soft exchanges over recipes in the kitchen, and how we had celebrated milestones with friends and family who had grown accustomed to the rhythm of our home. The years without him had been filled with quiet reflection, with small triumphs in maintaining the household, in staying connected to Michael and his family while respecting the distance they needed to build their own lives. And yet now, this letter had opened a doorway to emotions I had not anticipated, stirring a mixture of anticipation, doubt, and a peculiar sense of nostalgia. I thought of Linda, my daughter-in-law, how she moved through family gatherings with practiced charm, her smiles sometimes too perfect, her eyes occasionally betraying a calculating thought that I had learned to read with care over the years, and how Michael had become adept at balancing his affection for me with the obligations and pressures of his career and family. I took a slow sip of coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my hands, and I considered the possibilities, the reasons that James might have for sending this message now, after a decade of silence, and my mind began to map the paths that could lead from this single communication to revelations about hidden affairs, forgotten promises, or untold stories. I imagined opening each sentence carefully, letting the words sink in, analyzing every phrase for nuance, every punctuation for intention, and I sensed that the journey this letter would take me on was as much about understanding James' perspective as it was about reflecting on my own responses, my own growth, my own quiet strength cultivated in the absence of his presence. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant chirping of birds outside, and the filtered sunlight across the wooden floor created a serene backdrop, almost mocking the storm of thought inside my mind, and I realized that the ordinary routine of breakfast, of clearing dishes and straightening chairs, would no longer feel the same, now imbued with a sense of expectation and curiosity. I lifted the envelope, weighing it in my hands, feeling the subtle pressure of the seal, and I knew that with each careful turn of the paper, with each line read and reread, I was not merely revisiting the past but engaging with it, interrogating the years that had passed, reconciling with the memories, the joys and the regrets, and preparing myself for whatever truths, gentle or unsettling, lay within the careful, deliberate words James had left behind. A bridge across time connecting the living with the echoes of the departed, and I felt a strange reassurance that, no matter what, I had the composure, the patience, and the clarity to receive and respond to the message on my own terms, with the quiet dignity I had cultivated over the decade of his absence. The morning light shifted slowly across the living room, highlighting the worn edges of the photo frames that lined the mantelpiece, each one a frozen memory of birthdays, vacations, and quiet evenings with James, and I found myself tracing the contours of his face in the photographs, feeling both the ache of absence and the gentle warmth of remembrance. The letter rested on the coffee table, its presence commanding my attention as I sipped from my mug, the warmth seeping into my hands and reminding me of the small comforts I had cultivated over the years alone. I remembered the weekends spent organizing the garden, the careful pruning of roses and tulips, the satisfaction of seeing them bloom under my care, and how James had always watched with a quiet smile, never speaking more than a word or two, yet conveying his approval in the way he lingered nearby, his eyes soft and patient. The house was filled with that same quiet now, the ticking clock and the hum of the refrigerator punctuating the stillness, and I realized how much I had grown accustomed to the solitude, how deeply the rhythms of my life had settled into a pattern of gentle independence. I opened the letter once more, scanning the words slowly, absorbing the careful phrasing, the subtle hints and nuances that suggested more than mere nostalgia, that hinted at matters left unresolved, at messages meant to provoke thought, reflection, and perhaps even guidance for the decisions I had to make in the present. My mind wandered through memories of family gatherings, of Michael as a child running across the backyard laughing, his small hands reaching for mine as James and I exchanged smiles of quiet understanding, and I considered how those moments had shaped the people my son and daughter-in-law had become, the delicate balance between love, responsibility, and the unseen currents of intention that flowed beneath the surface of our interactions. I thought about Linda, how she had moved through holidays and dinners with a practiced poise, her words often carefully chosen, her gestures precise, and I considered how much she understood, how much she observed, and how much she concealed, and I realized that the letter, in its calm and deliberate manner, might illuminate truths that had remained hidden, that might allow me to see more clearly the motivations and desires of those around me. The light shifted again, catching the edge of the envelope and casting a thin shadow across the table, and I felt the anticipation building, a quiet, almost electric tension that made my fingers itch to uncover every line, every phrase, every implication of the careful script, knowing that the unfolding of these words would not only bring clarity to the past but also shape the choices I would make going forward. I let my gaze wander across the room, noticing the small details I had always loved, the way the morning light fell across the polished wood floors, the subtle pattern of the rug underfoot, the familiar arrangement of furniture that spoke of years of careful planning and lived experience, and I felt a sense of calm determination settle over me, a readiness to engage with whatever revelations the letter might hold. The sounds of the neighborhood filtered softly through the windows, distant voices and the rustle of leaves reminding me that life continued beyond the walls of my home, that the present was still unfolding even as the past reached out with its unexpected message, and I resolved to approach this discovery with patience, insight, and the quiet strength that had carried me through a decade of solitude, confident that each word I read would be another step in understanding, in reflection, and in the careful navigation of the path that lay before me. The afternoon sun had shifted, sending warm golden light across the living room and illuminating the familiar corners of my home that had grown silent over the years, and I could not help but notice how much space had accumulated around me, how much emptiness had settled into the rooms once filled with laughter and movement. I moved slowly from the kitchen to the sofa, carrying the letter with deliberate care, unfolding it again as if the words themselves might reveal more upon a second reading, each line unfolding with subtle emphasis, a cadence that felt almost intentional, and I reflected on the way James had always chosen his words with precision, the same care with which he approached the details of our lives together. I thought about the garden again, the early morning light catching dew on the petals of the roses, and I remembered how he had guided my hands through planting, how his presence had been steady and reassuring without being intrusive, the quiet support that had always underpinned our partnership. The letter seemed to capture some essence of that steadiness, an echo of his thoughtfulness, a connection across time that I had not anticipated, and I allowed myself to sit with the feeling, the slow understanding that it was not only the content of the words that mattered but the intent, the care, and the trust embedded within each sentence. I glanced around the room at the books lined along the shelves, each one a memory of shared reading and quiet conversation, and I recalled the many nights spent discussing stories, reflecting on characters and choices, and how those conversations had formed a subtle but enduring bond between us. The ticking of the clock was a metronome to my thoughts, a reminder of the hours slipping past as I absorbed the nuances of the letter, weighing each implication, considering the past in light of the present, and pondering the ways in which this unexpected communication might influence the days to come. I thought about Michael and Linda, how they had navigated life without James, how their own choices and habits had shaped the current dynamics of our family, and I wondered how the insights from the letter might clarify situations that had always felt just out of reach, leaving questions unanswered and intentions obscured. The afternoon light lengthened across the hardwood floors, casting long shadows and creating an atmosphere of introspection, and I felt a quiet anticipation as I considered the possible revelations, the hidden stories, the guidance or insight that James had chosen to leave behind, not as a disturbance, but as a gentle invitation to reflect, to understand, and to approach the future with a clarity tempered by years of experience and contemplation. I ran my fingers along the edges of the envelope, feeling the texture, the weight, the permanence of its presence in my hands, and I realized that the significance of this moment was not only in the words themselves but in the process of engagement, the deliberate act of attention and reflection, and the readiness to integrate what was revealed into the ongoing narrative of my life. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the distant sounds of the neighborhood continuing their gentle rhythm, a contrast to the intensity of the internal dialogue that the letter had sparked, and I recognized that this was a turning point, a moment in which past, present, and potential converged, offering both insight and a subtle challenge to navigate the complexities of memory, emotion, and family ties. I settled back into the sofa, allowing the sun to warm my face, the letter resting on my lap as I absorbed the day, and I understood that the unfolding of these words would be a gradual process, one that required patience, reflection, and a readiness to perceive the layers of meaning embedded within, the careful attention to detail that had always characterized the life James and I had shared, and the steady resolve that I had cultivated in the years since his passing to approach each new revelation with calm insight and the quiet strength that had carried me through the decade of his absence. The late afternoon light fell gently across the living room, casting long shadows over the furniture and highlighting the subtle imperfections that time had etched into the walls and floors, a reminder of the years that had passed and the quiet life I had maintained in the absence of James. I held the letter again, feeling the texture of the paper and the weight of its words, and I traced the lines of handwriting, each curve and stroke a testament to his care, his thoughtfulness, and the deliberate effort he had taken to communicate even after so much time. I thought about the small routines I had built around my days, the deliberate order of my mornings and evenings, the careful preparation of meals, the tending of the garden, and how these ordinary acts had become the foundation of my independence, the quiet rhythm of life that I had come to rely on. The letter seemed to draw me into a different dimension of reflection, one in which the past and present merged, allowing me to see the nuances of my relationships with Michael and Linda with renewed clarity, to understand the subtle tensions, the unspoken expectations, and the careful dance of civility and ambition that had always shaped our interactions. I considered the possibility that this message from James was meant to illuminate truths long buried, to offer guidance, insight, or a gentle correction, and I felt a mixture of anticipation and cautious excitement, aware that the unfolding of its content could shift perspectives, alter decisions, and bring long-awaited clarity. I moved to the window and looked out at the garden, noting the gentle sway of the trees, the birds hopping across the lawn, and the calmness of the neighborhood settling into evening, and I felt a quiet connection between the continuity of the world outside and the significance of what lay within the envelope. Each word I read seemed to hold multiple layers, a balance of affection, instruction, and observation that James had crafted with care, and I took my time absorbing each nuance, reflecting on the implications for my own life, for my understanding of the past, and for the ways I might navigate the future. I thought about the conversations I had shared with him over the years, the decisions we had made together, the small compromises and agreements that had shaped our household, and how this letter seemed to speak directly to the essence of those experiences, acknowledging them, expanding upon them, and inviting me to interpret them with the wisdom I had accumulated in his absence. I set the letter down briefly and poured another cup of coffee, the warmth and aroma grounding me, allowing me to focus my thoughts, to create a mental map of the potential revelations contained within, and to prepare for the deliberate contemplation required to integrate its meaning into the framework of my daily life. The soft ticking of the clock, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and the faint rustle of leaves outside created a serene backdrop, allowing the intensity of my focus to deepen, and I realized that this process was as much about understanding James as it was about reaffirming my own capacity for insight, reflection, and careful judgment. I returned to the letter, picking it up with renewed attention, and began to read once more, savoring the rhythm and cadence of the sentences, noting the subtle cues embedded within the phrasing, and recognizing the deliberate structure that mirrored his thoughtful character, a reflection of the precision and intentionality that had defined our years together, and now guided this extraordinary communication from beyond the decade that had passed since his absence. The evening settled gently over the neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of amber and soft lavender, and I remained in the living room, the letter still in my hands, my eyes scanning the words slowly as if each line held a secret waiting to be discovered, a hidden layer of meaning that required careful attention. I reflected on the way James had always approached our conversations with patience and subtlety, never rushing, never forcing, allowing time and reflection to draw out understanding and clarity, and it became clear to me that this letter was an extension of that same thoughtful approach, a bridge from the past into the present. I could feel the quiet rhythm of the house around me, the hum of the refrigerator, the gentle creak of the floorboards as I shifted in my chair, and I realized how accustomed I had become to these ordinary sounds, to the soft cadence of a life lived deliberately, and now, overlaid with the intensity of the letter, each sound took on new significance, marking moments of reflection and anticipation. I thought about the afternoons we had spent in the garden, the sun warming our backs as we planted new flowers, the quiet encouragement James offered, the small lessons in patience and attention to detail, and how those moments had shaped my ability to observe, to consider, and to respond thoughtfully, skills that now guided my approach to this unexpected communication. The letter itself seemed to pulse with intention, the careful choice of words, the phrasing, the order of ideas, all meticulously crafted to convey not only information but also the subtle guidance and insight that James had always embedded in his actions, a gentle encouragement to think deeply and respond wisely. I considered Michael and Linda, the ways they had established their lives and routines in the years since James had passed, the patterns of interaction and unspoken agreements that had formed between us, and how this letter might alter or clarify those dynamics, revealing new possibilities, perspectives, or opportunities for understanding and reconciliation. I set the letter aside for a moment and let my gaze wander across the room, noticing the familiar objects, the photographs, the carefully arranged furniture, the soft rug underfoot, all details that anchored me in the present while allowing my mind to navigate the layers of memory, expectation, and curiosity stirred by the letter. I thought about the decisions I had made in the past decade, the ways I had balanced my independence with connection to my family, the quiet routines that had provided structure and stability, and how this message now introduced a new variable, a point of reflection that demanded both attention and thoughtful consideration. As the sun continued to lower in the sky, casting elongated shadows across the floor, I felt a subtle sense of anticipation, the awareness that the unfolding of the letter's meaning would require patience, careful observation, and the measured application of insight, and that each sentence I read had the potential to reveal truths, clarify uncertainties, and guide my actions with the quiet wisdom cultivated through years of experience. I picked the letter up again, turning it in my hands, feeling the texture and weight, and allowed myself to read each line slowly, deliberately, absorbing not only the content but the intent, the careful thought embedded within, knowing that the process of engagement itself was a form of dialogue. Across time, a continuation of the understanding, empathy, and trust that had defined my relationship with James, and that now informed the way I approached this remarkable and unexpected message. The house had grown quiet as evening deepened, the soft glow of the lamps casting gentle shadows across the living room, and I sat on the sofa with the letter open before me, tracing the careful curves of James' handwriting while allowing the meaning of each sentence to settle slowly, deliberately, into my mind. I reflected on how much time had passed since his absence, 10 years of mornings with coffee in hand, the rhythm of solitary routines, the quiet satisfaction of tending to my garden, maintaining the house, and observing the subtle changes in my son Michael and in Linda, noticing their habits, their patterns, their unspoken understandings, and how all of these elements now intertwined with the message contained within this single, deliberate letter. The words carried a rhythm and intention that demanded attention, a subtle insistence that invited reflection without force, and I found myself reading and rereading phrases, exploring nuances, imagining the inflections in James' voice, the pauses he would have taken, the emphasis he might have placed on certain words, and in this process, I began to uncover a layered understanding, a deeper resonance that connected the past with the present in ways I had not anticipated. I thought about the decisions made over the years, the compromises, the negotiations, the moments of quiet patience and guidance, and I realized that the letter was less a mere recounting of memories and more a careful orchestration of insight, providing context, perspective, and an invitation to engage with these memories and experiences in a thoughtful and deliberate manner. The room seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, the subtle creaks of the floor, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft rustling of leaves outside, all accentuating the significance of this moment, allowing me to focus entirely on the contents before me and the implications they held for my understanding of the past and my approach to the future. I considered the relationships within the family, the dynamics that had developed between Michael and Linda, the subtle ways in which intentions and expectations had been communicated and interpreted over the years, and I realized that this letter was a key, a guide, and perhaps even a gentle corrective, offering insight into decisions made, opportunities missed, and lessons learned, all wrapped within the deliberate cadence of James' words. I allowed the weight of the years, the depth of my experiences, and the steady accumulation of observation and reflection to guide my reading, to shape my understanding, and to inform my sense of clarity, patience, and discernment, knowing that each phrase contained more than simple information, that each line reflected intention, care, and a nuanced understanding of human relationships. As the evening shadows deepened, the warmth of the lamplight softened the edges of the room, creating a cocoon of stillness in which I could fully absorb the subtleties of the letter, contemplate the patterns of past interactions, and consider the wisdom embedded within, understanding that this was a moment of both reflection and potential guidance, a convergence of memory, insight, and deliberate engagement with the lessons and intentions James had chosen to leave behind, and I felt a renewed sense of readiness, calm focus, and thoughtful anticipation as I prepared to integrate these revelations into the ongoing narrative of my life and family. The twilight deepened outside, the sky shifting into gentle shades of indigo and soft rose, and I remained by the living room window, the letter open in my lap, absorbing each phrase as though the words themselves contained the passage of time and the weight of history. I traced the lines of script with careful fingers, feeling the texture of the paper and the deliberate spacing of the words, and I thought about how James had always approached communication with intention, ensuring that meaning was conveyed not only through what was said but through the way it was presented, the pauses, the phrasing, the subtle emphasis. I considered the years that had passed, the quiet routine I had maintained in his absence, the mornings spent brewing coffee and reading the newspaper, the afternoons tending to the garden, arranging flowers, and maintaining the house with deliberate care, each action a meditation, a connection to the life we had built together. The words of the letter seemed to unfold a new layer of understanding, guiding me to reflect on the nuances of family interactions, the subtle dynamics between Michael and Linda, the choices they had made, and how the insights from this letter could illuminate intentions, clarify misunderstandings, and reveal patterns that had previously been hidden from view. I thought about the past decade, the ways I had navigated family events, holidays, and gatherings with quiet observation, noting behaviors, listening for tones, reading expressions, and considering motivations, and I realized that this letter was a continuation of the lessons James had imparted, a thoughtful message meant to provoke reflection and careful consideration rather than dictate action. I allowed myself to lean back, letting the warmth of the lamplight wash over the room, the soft ticking of the clock and the occasional distant sounds from the neighborhood grounding me as I contemplated the meanings embedded within the letter, the subtleties, the gentle reminders, and the deliberate encouragement to view past events with clarity and perspective. Each line prompted a cascade of thoughts, memories of conversations shared with James, the quiet guidance he had offered, the ways he had instilled patience and discernment, and I felt a renewed sense of purpose in interpreting these words, appreciating not only their content but the manner in which they were conveyed. I set the letter carefully on the table beside me, the envelope still present, and allowed my mind to wander through scenarios, possibilities, and reflections, imagining how this message might alter understanding, influence decisions, and deepen insight into the choices and paths taken over the past 10 years. The room, filled with the soft glow of evening, seemed to cocoon me in a space of quiet contemplation, allowing me to absorb fully the significance of this communication, to consider its implications for the present and future, and to embrace the thoughtful, deliberate approach that James had always exemplified, guiding me toward clarity, reflection, and the capacity to navigate what lay ahead with calm awareness, measured judgment, and the quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of experience, observation, and deliberate living. The night had fully settled outside, and the living room was bathed in the soft, golden glow of the lamps, the shadows stretching across the furniture and floor, creating a calm, contemplative atmosphere. I held the letter in my hands one final time for the evening, feeling the delicate weight of the paper, the careful loops of James' handwriting, and the subtle spacing that conveyed so much of his character, and I reflected on the messages embedded within, the guidance and perspective he had shared across time, connecting the past with the present in ways that I had only begun to understand. I thought about the years that had passed since his absence, the quiet mornings spent brewing coffee, tending the garden, and maintaining the home with deliberate attention to detail, and I recognized how these routines had prepared me to engage with this letter thoughtfully, to consider its implications with patience, clarity, and measured judgment. The words themselves carried a rhythm, a cadence that encouraged reflection, allowing me to revisit memories, past conversations, and moments shared with James, all while drawing connections to the present, to the dynamics of my family, to the subtle behaviors and patterns I had observed over the years with Michael and Linda, and how this insight might guide my understanding of their intentions, their decisions, and the intricate tapestry of relationships that had developed in our absence of him. I observed the photographs on the mantel, the moments frozen in time, each smile, each glance, each gesture, and I felt the presence of history surrounding me, the echoes of laughter, quiet conversations, and simple routines that had shaped our family life, And I recognized that this letter was both a continuation and an extension of that history, a thoughtful bridge crafted with intention and care, meant to offer insight and perspective rather than immediate answers. I placed the letter gently on the coffee table, the envelope still lying beneath it, and leaned back, allowing the quiet hum of the house to envelop me, the distant sounds from the street outside adding a subtle rhythm to the stillness, and I considered the unfolding of time, the accumulation of understanding, and the ways in which insight, patience, and careful observation could bring clarity and resolution to situations that had long remained ambiguous. Each line of the letter seemed to expand with meaning, guiding me to reflect not only on the intentions of James but also on my own growth, the skills and wisdom cultivated over the past decade, the patience, discernment, and resilience that had allowed me to navigate my life with thoughtful engagement, and now empowered me to interpret this unexpected communication with calm awareness and clarity. I allowed the room, the soft light, the quiet atmosphere, and the gentle ticking of the clock to serve as companions in this process, creating a space in which thought and reflection could unfold naturally, unhurried, deliberate, and insightful, and I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction, of readiness and of clarity, knowing that this message, carefully crafted and thoughtfully delivered, would continue to resonate with me, shaping understanding, guiding reflection, and providing a meaningful connection between the past, present, and the possibilities of the future.